The road north of Jaipur runs through scrubland for a long stretch before the Aravalli Hills begin to assert themselves against the horizon. The hills appear gradually, as hills in flat country always do, first as a suggestion of elevation, then as a broken line of stone ridges growing more distinct through the haze. The vegetation changes as the road climbs. Thorn scrub gives way to denser woodland, dry deciduous forest pressing close to the verge, the light coming through in longer angles and cooler tones. At a certain point along the approach from the northeast, where the track narrows and the Aravalli foothills close in on both sides, the sandstone walls of Bhangarh Fort become visible for the first time above the tree line. They appear as a long horizontal line of cut stone running across the face of the hillside, higher than the canopy, pale amber against the gray and green of the rock behind them. The line is interrupted at intervals by towers, square-built, rising a course or two above the main wall, set at distances that would once have given a sentry a clean view across the plain below, and along the length of the wall in both directions. From here, from the track below, the scale is not immediately apparent. The walls look contained. They look at this distance like something a person might walk around in an hour. That impression changes as the approach continues, and the wall simply does not end, stretching further in both directions than the first view suggested. The towers more numerous than they appeared from a distance, the structure larger, older, and more deliberate than the scrub woodland around it, prepared a visitor to expect. Bhangarh Fort was founded in 1573. That date, precise and documented in the court records of the Mughal administration, and corroborated by the architectural conventions visible in the oldest surviving structures, places its construction during one of the more consequential periods in the political organization of northern India. The Mughal Emperor Akbar had been consolidating his empire through a system of alliances with the Rajput clans of Rajasthan, absorbing them not by conquest alone, but by incorporation, by marriage, by the granting of titles and military appointments that bound Rajput generals to the imperial project, while leaving the clans considerable autonomy within their own territories. Raja Bhagwant Das of the Kuchwaha clan was one of those generals. He served Akbar directly, held significant military rank within the imperial hierarchy, and was given the resources and the political sanction to establish a secondary royal seat in the Aravalli Hill region south of what is now Alwar district. That secondary seat was Bhangarh. It was built not as a purely defensive outpost and not as a retreat from political life, but as a functioning extension of the Kuchwaha administrative and residential presence in this part of Rajasthan, a place where the business of a noble house could be conducted, where a royal household could be maintained, and where the surrounding region could be governed from a position of visible, architecturally articulated authority. The walls are built from local sandstone and granite, quarried from the same Aravalli ridges against which they stand. The stone is warm-toned in direct light, going gray in shadow, and the cut faces of the older sections have weathered to a surface that catches oblique light in a particular way, the tool marks still faintly visible in sheltered courses, the exposed faces worn smooth by 3.5 centuries of monsoon and dry season alternation. At the approach from the north, the boundary wall runs from the hillside on the east across the lower valley floor and back up to the hillside on the west, enclosing the entire settled area within a perimeter that would have been visually legible from a considerable distance across the plain, a statement of territory as much as a practical measure of defense. The watchtowers along this wall are not evenly spaced, but positioned at intervals determined by the terrain, placed where the ground gave defenders a natural advantage, or where a section of wall was otherwise visually exposed. Some towers survive to close to their original height. Others are reduced to the lower courses. Their upper sections collapsed inward or weathered away, leaving the wall's profile irregular, rising and falling as the boundary traverses the hillside above the tree line. Under Madho Singh I, the younger son of Bhagwant Das, the settlement at Bhangarh expanded considerably. Madho Singh appears in historical records as a capable administrator who used the political stability of his father's alliances to develop the site into a genuine town rather than maintaining it solely as a noble residence. The population under his tenure is estimated by historians studying the physical evidence, the scale of the market infrastructure, the number and distribution of residential structures, the capacity of the water systems, the presence of multiple temples serving different communities and functions, to have reached several thousand. That number includes not only the royal household and its attendant servants, soldiers, and administrators, but a functioning civilian population, merchants who maintained premises in the bazaar, craftspeople supplying the court and the residence, priests attached to the several temples, laborers whose work maintained the infrastructure and agricultural activity in the surrounding valley. The north to south axis of the fort is clear from any elevated vantage point within the complex. The main road runs south from the northern entrance gate, climbing gradually along the length of the enclosed area toward the palace at the far end, which sits on elevated ground near the southern boundary wall, where the hillside rises more steeply behind it. This arrangement is not unusual for a Rajput settlement of this period. The palace at the high point, the administrative and commercial functions in the middle ground, the markets and residential areas for ordinary inhabitants closest to the main gate, and the approach from the plains below. What is notable at Bhangarh is the extent of the area enclosed. The walled perimeter encompasses several kilometers, making this less a fort in the narrow military sense and more a walled town, the defensive architecture merely the outer expression of an entire settled community with its own economy, its own religious institutions, and its own spatial logic visible in the graduated organization of the ground it occupied. The main bazaar runs along the central road through the middle section of the fort. Walking through it today, the shop structures stand on both sides of the path in a condition that is ruined but not shapeless, the walls surviving to varying heights, some to the level of what would have been the eaves, others reduced to a course or two above the ground, but the spacing and the differentiation of scale among them, preserving enough information to understand the commercial geography of the street as it functioned in the early 17th century. Larger premises alternate with smaller ones, but some structures have back walls thick enough to have served as storage. Others are open on multiple sides in a way consistent with display stalls, rather than enclosed shops. The distribution is uneven in the way that markets everywhere tend to become uneven over time. In prime positions near the gate or the main thoroughfare, more densely occupied, the pattern recording not the blueprint of the original planners, but the accumulated decisions of individual merchants over several generations of commercial life. From the bazaar, the road continues southward and the ground rises. The intermediate section of the fort held residential structures, and what the architectural record suggests were administrative buildings, the remains distinguishable from purely domestic structures by their scale, the quality of the remaining stonework, and in some cases by the configuration of the rooms, which imply functions beyond simple habitation. These middle ground structures are, as a category, the most thoroughly reduced by time, their walls standing lower on average than either the perimeter defenses or the major temples, their materials having been more extensively quarried by later populations for use elsewhere once the settlement was no longer maintained. The absence of consistent roofing across this section gives it, on any ordinary afternoon, an open quality that is simply the condition of ruins that have been open to the sky for several hundred years. The stonework weathered to the same tones as the hillside, the vegetation growing in the joints and across the floors, the boundary between what was built and what grew back somewhat eroded. The Gopinath Temple stands within the complex as one of its most architecturally complete surviving structures. It is dedicated to Lord Vishnu in his aspect as Gopinath, and it retains what the surrounding structures have lost: its roof, its carved stone columns, the pillared mandapa or entrance hall leading to the sanctum, the full vertical presence of a building that was designed to be seen as a whole rather than reconstructed mentally from incomplete remains. The columns are detailed work, the carvings still legible after centuries of exposure, the surfaces worn but not degraded to the point where the figures and patterns cannot be read. This is not a preserved ruin in the sense of a site that has received ongoing conservation. It is a structure that has survived because its function continued after the surrounding secular settlement was abandoned, because the religious use of the space maintained an investment in its upkeep beyond what the administrative and commercial buildings received. Other temples within the fort complex are in comparable condition relative to the domestic and commercial buildings around them, their roof structures intact where the shop walls and palace chambers have lost theirs. The pattern is consistent across the site, the religious architecture standing to its original height, the secular and domestic structures open above their surviving wall lines. The fort sits in the Alwar district of Rajasthan within the Aravalli Range, roughly 83 kilometers from Alwar city and approximately 90 kilometers from Jaipur. Those distances help establish the site's geographic position in the political geography of the region, not adjacent to either of those major administrative centers, but between them in territory that the Kachwaha clan controlled during the period of Bhangarh's occupation, positioned at the edge of a valley that provided both a defensible approach from the north and access to the seasonal water flows coming down from the higher ground of the Aravalli Hills to the south and east. The valley orientation is part of why the site was chosen. Monsoon rainfall in the Aravalli region is irregular and not particularly generous, the geography making some sections of the range more sheltered and some more exposed to the dry conditions of the Thar Desert to the west. The valley in which Bhangarh sits collects and directs the seasonal flow, concentrating moisture in a way that made the ground more productive for the agricultural activity that supported the town and making it feasible to engineer reliable water access for the resident population through the excavation of step wells and the management of the surface drainage. A step well in this context is not merely a hole in the ground, but a considered piece of hydraulic engineering, the masonry descending in graduated levels, steps rather than a simple shaft, to reach the water table below the Aravalli terrain. The construction of multiple step wells, known locally as bayuris, within the fort perimeter indicates that the founders and their successors devoted significant resources to solving the water supply problem at a scale adequate for several thousand residents. The wells were not purely functional objects, but built with a quality of stonework that placed them architecturally within the same register as the temples and the palace, surfaces that were dressed rather than rough-faced, geometries that were precise, the descent into the earth treated as a kind of architecture in its own right. One of these stepwells survives within the fort perimeter, with its masonry largely intact, the stone stairs descending from ground level toward the seasonal water table below, the construction solid enough that the passage of 3 centuries of monsoon flooding and dry season contraction has not substantially displaced the individual cut stones. The well itself is dry or silted over at most times of year. The stairs go down into shadow and arrive at nothing a visitor can use. The engineering that was once the point of the structure is now simply the evidence that the structure existed and that the people who built it intended it to last. The political circumstances under which Bhangarh was established and developed did not remain stable. Rajputana in the 17th century was a space of negotiated relationships between the Rajput clans and the Mughal court, a balance that depended on the personal relationship between specific Mughal emperors and the generals and nobles who served them. The accession of Aurangzeb to the Mughal throne in 1658 disrupted those relationships across Rajputana in ways that took decades to fully manifest. Aurangzeb's approach to the Rajput clans was less accommodating than his predecessors, his military campaigns more aggressive in territories where earlier emperors had maintained working alliances, and the political structure that had allowed the Kuchwaha clan to develop and maintain a settlement, like Bhangarh, was progressively weakened through the decades of his reign. The destabilization radiating outward from Aurangzeb's campaigns reached different parts of Rajputana at different times and in different ways, and the Bhangarh area was not immediately or dramatically affected. But the conditions that had supported a population of several thousand in this particular valley, the political stability, the trade networks, the administrative investment in the site's infrastructure, eroded across the second half of the 17th century. The population of the Alwar district and of Rajputana more broadly also faced a documented severe famine in the early 18th century. Famine in an already arid region with a regular water supply is not a gradual or manageable process for a settlement that has already seen its political and administrative foundations weaken. The historical records that document the famine, administrative accounts, chronicles, the records of religious and charitable institutions that responded to the crisis, describe conditions across Rajputana in the first decades of the 18th century that would have made the maintenance of a large walled settlement in a valley dependent on seasonal water systems extremely difficult. The agricultural hinterland that supplied Bhangarh's markets and fed its population was the first thing to fail. The merchants and craftspeople whose livelihoods depended on that hinterland would have had little reason to remain when the supply chains that sustained their businesses collapsed. The soldiers and administrators whose presence gave the settlement its political function would have moved with the power structures that employed them. What remained, after the political conditions shifted and the famine drove the population out, was the stone itself, the walls, the wells, the temple columns, the shop fronts, the palace archways. The historical and archaeological consensus places Bhangarh's effective abandonment at approximately 1720 CE. The dating comes from several converging lines of evidence, the absence of any significant construction after a certain period, the architectural features that are consistent with early Kuchwaha building traditions, rather than the later styles that would be expected if the site had continued to be actively developed. The political records that show the Kuchwaha administrative focus shifting to other centers after the period of Mughal destabilization. The date of 1720 is not a sharp line, but a point around which the evidence converges, indicating that by that time the population had reduced to a level that left the settlement effectively non-functional as a town, even if some residual habitation or use of the site continued for a period afterward. There is a particular quality to the archaeological record at Bhangarh that is worth sitting with carefully, because it says something specific about how the abandonment happened. The decay across building types within the fort complex is, according to the architectural historians and archaeologists who have studied the site, relatively uniform. This is not a site where a slow shrinkage of population produced a pattern of selective use. The best buildings maintained, while secondary structures fell into disrepair. The most valuable spaces preserved, while peripheral areas were allowed to deteriorate. What the physical evidence records instead is a consistency of decline across the full range of building types and locations within the perimeter. Palace and shop, and residential structure and administrative buildings share broadly the same degree of deterioration, the same state of rooflessness, the same level of vegetation encroachment and weathering. The religious buildings are an exception, but their preservation is explained by the continuation of religious use that maintained an ongoing investment in their upkeep. Everything else shows a uniformity of condition that is more consistent with a comparatively rapid departure than with a prolonged and selective process of gradual abandonment. In a large settlement, gradual population loss leaves marks in the physical record. Buildings are cannibalized for materials. The best positioned structures are maintained longest. The areas closest to the remaining population center hold out, while the peripheral zones are progressively given over to disuse. None of that selective pattern is strongly visible at Bhangarh. What archaeologists and architectural historians have described instead is a state of decay that is broadly consistent across the site, which implies that when the population left, it left across the full range of the settlement's geography, rather than retreating inward to a smaller and smaller core. The evidence cannot specify a date for this departure, or tell us over how many years or months it unfolded. It can say that the departure, whenever it happened, and for whatever combination of reasons, was thorough enough to leave no substantial structure in better condition than any other, as if the entire settlement crossed a threshold together and the stone left behind and without maintenance began its slow return to the state of the hillside around it at something close to the same time. The palace at the elevated southern end of the fort retains its outer walls and its sequence of gateways, 3 or 4, depending on how the transitions between enclosures are counted, each one bringing the approaching visitor to a successive level of the complex, the architecture marking the gradual approach to the royal residence through spatial transitions that would once have carried considerable political and ceremonial weight. The innermost enclosure, the space that would have been the most private and most protected section of the royal household, is now open to the sky, its floor broken and overgrown, the stone the same warm amber as the boundary walls below. The ornamental archways are still standing, the proportions still clear, the work of the stonecutters still legible in the decorated lintels and the shaped voussoirs of the arch. Nothing of the wooden elements that would once have completed the interior, doors, screens, roof beams, the fittings of a functioning royal residence, survives above ground. What remains is the permanent part of a permanent structure, the stone bones of a place from which all softer material has long since gone. From the palace terrace on a clear afternoon, the view north across the full length of the fort complex carries a long way. The terraced levels of the ruined town descend toward the plain in a pattern of broken walls and open rectangles, the geometry of the original settlement still readable in the spacing and alignment of the surviving stonework, the logic of the plan still present in the landscape, even though the buildings themselves are 3 centuries into their slow return to rubble. The boundary walls at the northern edge are visible from here as a lower line of stone, the watchtowers rising at their intervals, the gap of the main gate visible as a break in the wall, where the approach road entered from the scrub woodland below. Beyond the walls, the plain stretches away to the north in the flat light of the late afternoon, the thorn scrub and dry woodland extending to the horizon, the Aravalli Hills rising again in the distance as a darker line. The hills that are visible from the palace terrace are the same hills that supplied the stone for the walls, the temples, the palace, the stepwells. The quarrying was done in the Aravalli ridges, immediately adjacent to the settlement, using the geography of the site as the material source for the site itself. The walls are the hillside, rearranged. The stepwell is the hillside, excavated. The temple columns are the hillside, shaped. This is not an unusual feature of stone construction in any period or culture, but at Bhangarh, the proximity of the quarry source to the finished structure gives the relationship a particular legibility. Standing on the palace terrace and looking at the hills, what is visible is both where the stone came from and where it went, the raw material and the finished work occupying the same view. Historical records indicate the settlement was largely abandoned by approximately 1720 CE. The political disruptions of the Aurangzeb campaigns, the subsequent destabilization of Rajputana's administrative and military structures, and the documented famine of the early 18th century account, in combination, for a process of population loss that the historical record does not preserve in sufficient granular detail to trace year by year. What the historical record provides is the before, a functioning town, a market, a palace, multiple temples, several thousand inhabitants, and the after, which is the stone. The gap between those two states is the abandonment, and the question of exactly how it happened, over what period, in what sequence, remains open in the ways that such questions tend to remain open when the documentation thins and what survives is entirely material rather than written. The uniformity of the physical decay across the site is an architectural observation, not an explanation. It narrows the field of possible scenarios. A slow centuries-long dwindling becomes harder to sustain as a reading of the evidence when the evidence shows broadly equal deterioration across areas that would, in any prolonged and selective decline, have been maintained to different standards at different rates. A comparatively rapid departure fits the physical record more cleanly. The reasons for such a departure, the famine, the political collapse, both together, some third factor not yet fully weighted in the scholarly accounts, are documented in outline and debated in the details. The physical evidence offers one piece of the picture. The buildings that were left behind as a set, more or less together, and the stone has been weathering back toward the Aravalli hillside ever since, at its own pace, indifferent to the question of why it was abandoned, and in no particular hurry to produce the answer. In the stone corridor of the Bhangarh Bazaar, on an ordinary morning, sometime in the early 17th century, a maidservant stopped at one of the market stalls to purchase scented oil. This is where the story begins, according to the version most commonly told by guides who walk the site today. The stall would have been one of many along the main north-south road, a narrow shop, open-fronted, the kind of small commercial premises that lined both sides of the market in a functioning medieval town. The maidservant made her purchase. She carried the oil away, and somewhere in that ordinary transaction, according to the oral tradition that has moved through this region for several centuries, something went very wrong. The figure who set the story in motion is known as Singya. He appears nowhere in the official historical record, not in the dynastic chronicles, not in the administrative documents, not in the stone inscriptions that survive at the site. What survives instead is a body of oral tradition, circulating across the Alwar district and the wider Jaipur region, that describes him as a practitioner of tantric knowledge who lived near the fort during the period of its occupation. The accounts are consistent in their broad outline. He was learned, his knowledge was genuine, and he directed it, in the version that has become the dominant telling, toward Princess Ratnavati of the Kachwaha royal family, with a fixation that the tradition describes as the consuming kind, the kind that does not respond to ordinary discouragements, the kind that finds other routes when the direct one is closed. The oil was his instrument. According to the most widely told version of the legend, Singya encountered the maidservant in the bazaar corridor and worked upon her purchase, working into it, by means of tantric practice, what the tradition calls a love spell. The intention was that the oil, once applied, would redirect the princess's affections toward him. It is the kind of story that folklorists studying the oral traditions of Rajasthan have documented in many forms across many districts. The misuse of legitimate spiritual knowledge for coercive personal ends, the powerful practitioner who turns his abilities toward what he wants rather than what he is permitted to want. Singya, in this version, is not a man without knowledge. He is a man whose knowledge has been bent in the wrong direction. That distinction matters to how the tradition tells it. The princess perceived the enchantment. This is the pivot on which the dominant version of the story turns, and it is handled with economy in most tellings. She knew, or she sensed, or she understood through some faculty. The story does not stop to explain. What she did with that understanding was immediate and decisive. She took the oil and dashed it against a boulder. The spell broke, and there the matter might have ended, except that in the most dramatic tellings, the story does not stop there. The shattered oil, or the force of the broken enchantment itself, caused the boulder to animate and roll back towards Singya. In these versions, the boulder crushed him. The princess's act of perception and refusal became the instrument of his death, the karmic return of a harm intended for another. It is worth pausing on that detail, not because the guides who tell it treat it as the most important part, but because it is precisely the kind of element that varies most significantly across different versions of the tradition. The rolling boulder is vivid. It is satisfying in the narrative sense, a clear consequence following from a clear transgression, but it is absent from the more restrained tellings, the ones that end the confrontation between Singya and the princess at the moment the bottle breaks, without the additional mechanism of the boulder's movement. Folklorists who have spent time with regional oral traditions have noted this kind of variation as a feature of living oral narrative rather than a flaw in it. Stories that circulate across generations and across different communities accumulate details and shed them as they move. The core event, the enchantment, the perception, the refusal remains stable. The consequences of the refusal vary with the teller and the audience. What is consistent across nearly all versions is what comes after. Singya, before he died, pronounced a curse upon Bhangarh. The specific wording of the curse, as traditions of this kind generally work, is not recorded with precision, but its terms appear across the telling with reasonable regularity. The fort would be abandoned. The structures within it would decay. No roof would stand over any dwelling within the walls, because no living inhabitants would remain to shelter beneath one. The curse in most versions extends across generations and across time, not reaching a point of termination. The tradition identifies. It simply persists, as curses in these stories tend to persist, not as an active force operating on the present, but as the permanent consequence of a boundary violation that cannot be repaired. The temples within the fort are, in most tellings, the exception, a curse that pulls down all the human habitation within a walled town might be expected to spare the places that belong by nature to something other than human ambition. This is how local guides often explain the visible contrast that any visitor to Bhangarh can observe. The roofless stone shells of the shops and residences along the bazaar road, the roofless chambers of the palace, and then the temple standing comparatively intact, their columns still upright, their carved mandapas still holding their coverings. The temples were not what the curse was for. They were not raised by the specific kind of ambition the story condemns. They remain. This spatial pattern, roofless dwellings, intact temples, is not unique to Bhangarh, and architectural historians would point to structural reasons for it. Temple construction in the medieval Rajput tradition used materials and methods specifically intended to endure, concentrating the most skilled craftsmanship and the densest stone in sacred buildings, rather than commercial or residential ones. The temples were built to last in ways that ordinary shop premises were not. But within the landscape of the oral tradition, the pattern carries a different logic. Legible, spatially explicit, available to any visitor who stands at the right elevation within the complex and looks along the length of the ruins. The story has arranged itself in stone. The distinction between what the curse took and what it left is written in the roof lines. The version just described is the dominant one, the one most commonly encountered in journalistic accounts of the site, in the narration of guides who walk the bazaar road with groups of visitors, in the documentary films that have examined the legend. But Bhangarh has a second version, and the second version tells a different story, with different terms and a different moral center. Folklorists working in the Alwar district have recorded a variant in which the central figure is not described as Singya at all, but simply as a tantric holy man, sometimes called an ascetic, sometimes a sadhu, who extended protection over the fort and its inhabitants during the period of its occupation. The nature of this protection was conditional. It came with a requirement. No building within the walls of Bhangarh could be constructed to a height that exceeded the height of the holy man's own hermitage. This was the agreed boundary. The protection held as long as the boundary held. In this version, the transgressor is not a practitioner of forbidden desire, but a nobleman, a figure of rank and ambition, who commissioned a building that rose above the permitted height. The reasons for the commission are not always specified. Sometimes the tradition implies simple pride. Sometimes it implies a desire for elevation that was architectural before it was metaphorical. The nobleman built upward. The building exceeded the limit. The holy man's curse, when it came, followed from a violated agreement rather than from a rejected obsession, from ambition rather than desire, from the breaking of a sacred compact rather than the misuse of a sacred art. The abandonment of Bhangarh, in this version, is the consequence of a different kind of transgression entirely. What is striking about these two versions, and what folklorists who have worked with the Bhangarh oral tradition have found genuinely worth examining, is not that they contradict each other. Both circulate, both are told, both are accepted by the communities that tell them without apparent need to resolve the contradiction. What is striking is that the two versions share a structural skeleton while distributing moral weight differently across it. In both versions, there is a person of spiritual power who has a relationship to the fort, a transgression committed by someone connected to the fort, a curse pronounced as a consequence of that transgression, and an abandonment of Bhangarh that follows. The skeleton is identical, and what changes is the nature of the transgression and the nature of the transgressor. Desire is the concern in one version, the sorcerer who cannot contain what he wants, who weaponizes his knowledge rather than accepting the limits of his situation, who turns a spiritual art toward a coercive personal end. He is the figure the story condemns. The harm he intended for the princess returns to him. His curse on the fort is the final expression of the same consuming fixation that produced the enchanted oil. The moral logic is circular in the way these stories are often circular, each element reflecting the others. Ambition is the concern in the other. The nobleman who will not accept the constraint placed on him, who builds above the limit, because rank and wealth and the desire for visible height have made the constraint feel intolerable. He is the figure the story condemns. His transgression is not against a person, but against an agreement, not against an individual, but against a sacred boundary. The punishment is proportionate. A man who reached too high loses the fort he reached with. Folklorists studying Rajasthani oral traditions have described this kind of variability as a sign of a story's vitality rather than its confusion. A narrative that has been circulating for several centuries in a region with multiple distinct communities, traders, priests, soldiers, farming villages, hereditary storytellers, will absorb different moral concerns as it passes through different hands. The communities that live close to agricultural land and seasonal water scarcity may tell a version in which ambition and resource violation are the central transgressions. Communities with a closer relationship to the court and its political structures may tell a version in which desire and the misuse of privileged knowledge carry more weight. The story accommodates both. It keeps both. It does not choose between them. This adaptability is precisely what makes the Bhangarh legend worth examining as a story in its own right, separate from questions about what caused the actual abandonment of the actual fort. The legend is not competing with the archaeological record. It is not trying to be the archaeological record. It is doing something different, providing a moral framework in which an otherwise puzzling historical event becomes interpretable, the kind of framework that a community needs when a large and once inhabited place empties out, and the reasons for that emptying become unclear with time. Something went wrong at Bhangarh. People left, the buildings fell to ruin. The legend assigns that sequence a cause, a transgressor, a mechanism, and a consequence. It makes the abandonment legible. The maidservant carrying scented oil through the bizarre corridor is the point at which the legend chooses to begin, not at the construction of the fort, not at the founding of the dynasty, not at the first sign of political instability in the region. The story starts with an ordinary purchase in a market, a transaction that must have been repeated in that bazaar on an ordinary basis across the years of the settlement's occupation. Oil, cloth, grain, spice, passing between sellers and buyers along the stone corridor that still stands. Roofless, running south toward the palace. The choice of beginning is interesting. The legend could have started with Singhia and his desire. It could have started with the princess and her gifts of perception. It starts instead with a maidservant doing an errand, and that domestic ordinariness is what gives the story its scale. The disruption that follows is measured against what came before it, which was simply an ordinary morning in a working town. The bizarre corridor exists. That is the thing about the Bhangarh legend that guides consistently emphasize to visitors. The physical spaces the story moves through are all still there. The road is still there, running north to south, the stone walls of the former shop premises rising on both sides to varying heights, roofless, the sky wide above the corridor. The guides walk the route that the maidservant walked in the story, from the market section uphill toward the palace, and the geography of the legend maps onto the geography of the ruins in a way that the guides describe as self-evident. The story has a specific route through the fort. A visitor who walks it is covering the same ground that the legend covers. The boulder is pointed out to most visiting groups. Its precise location varies somewhat depending on which guide is leading the tour and which version of the legend they are drawing on. But there is generally a specific large stone, naturally occurring, unremarkable in itself, the kind of granite boulder that the Aravalli Hills produce in abundance, that has been designated within the oral tradition as the one referenced in the story. Most visitors walk past it without registering it as anything in particular until the guide points to it. Then it becomes significant. The designation is entirely a function of the story rather than of anything visible in the stone itself, which is simply a large and old piece of rock sitting in a landscape full of large and old pieces of rock. But that too is how these traditions work. Meaning is attached to place, and the attachment persists as long as the story is told. The palace at the top of the hill is where the maidservant was heading when the oil was intercepted. This is a detail that the dominant version of the legend includes without always emphasizing. The purchase was made, the enchantment applied, and then the journey uphill toward the palace continued, or was supposed to continue, until the princess perceived what the oil contained. The palace as a destination gives the story a trajectory. The bazaar is the middle ground. The palace at the high southern end is the end point. The intervening terrain is where the story's critical moment occurs, somewhere between the commerce of the market and the privacy of the royal quarters, in the transitional space that a walled town always contains between its public and its intimate geographies. That spatial logic is part of what makes the Bhangarh legend so available to the landscape. The story moves through the fort, from north to south, from market to palace, following the same uphill path that a visitor walks today. The ruins provide the setting. The setting provides the story with a specific geography that a general-purpose folk narrative about desire and transgression would not otherwise have. And the story, in return, gives the ruins a narrative reason for their current state. Each supports the other. The stone corridor of the bazaar is legible as a place where ordinary commerce once happened, and where, on one specific morning, something happened that was not ordinary. The palace at the top is legible as the destination that gave the enchantment its purpose. The roofless dwellings on either side of the road are legible as the consequence of what was set in motion. The guides who walk these routes have been telling these stories, or versions of them, across many generations. The current guides have their own professional interest in the legend. Bhangarh's status as India's most widely discussed haunted location generates the tourism that generates their employment, and the oral tradition they carry is both a cultural inheritance and an economic instrument. They say this themselves with straightforward acknowledgement when researchers or journalists ask about it. The legend brings people here. The people need someone to walk the route with them and explain what they are seeing. The guides fill that function, and the legend is part of what makes the function necessary. This is not a complicated relationship. It is simply what happens when a place acquires a story, and the story acquires a reputation, and the reputation acquires an economy. There is a specific detail that the more careful accounts of the Bhangarh legend tend to preserve even when they are compressing the narrative for a general audience. In the most dramatic tellings, the ones with the rolling boulder, of the ones with the maximum cinematic intensity, the princess is described not merely as perceiving the enchantment, but as perceiving it specifically because her own spiritual knowledge or acuity was sufficient to recognize what tantric practice had done to the oil. She is not a passive recipient of a warning. She is herself a figure of some discernment. The oil's alteration is something she reads rather than something she is merely told, and the act of dashing it against the boulder is therefore not an act of panic or disgust, but an act of deliberate counter-response. The enchantment is not just refused, it is returned. This characterization of the princess varies across tellings, as most details do. Some versions give her a more passive role. She is warned by a trusted attendant, or she simply knows by intuition, and the story does not pause to establish the nature of her knowledge. But the versions that give her active discernment do something specific to the moral architecture of the legend. Singya's transgression is not merely that he desired what he could not have, it is that he underestimated the one he desired. He assumed that his art, applied to an ordinary object passing through ordinary hands, would remain invisible. It did not, and the consequence of that underestimation is the mechanism of his defeat. The boulder that the story sends back toward him is in the most dramatically elaborate tellings a function of the princess's active refusal rather than simply a magical side effect of a broken bottle. The curse that follows Singya's death is sometimes framed in these versions as his final act, a pronouncement made as the boulder moved, or in the moment between impact and the end, time that the story compresses into an instant of speech. This is a common structure in the curse narratives of the Rajasthan oral tradition. The cursor is defeated, but not silent. The defeat does not cancel the harm. It produces it, and what Bhangarh receives in the aftermath of the confrontation in the second version's framework too is a fort without living inhabitants, buildings without roofs, an occupation that ends and does not resume. The region has told this story in its various forms for approximately as long as the fort has been abandoned. The scholars who have collected versions of it across the Alwar district do not have a precise date for the legend's origin. Oral traditions rarely leave dated records of their own emergence. What they can establish is that the story is old enough to have generated the multiple variants now documented, old enough to have attached itself permanently to the specific geography of the ruins, and old enough to have become genuinely local in the sense that matters, told not only by guides to visiting outsiders, but by villagers to each other, as part of the ongoing account of the place they live beside. The village of Gola Kabas sits immediately adjacent to the fort. Its residents have lived within sight of the Bhangarh walls for generations. The legend, for them, is not a tourist attraction in the primary sense. It is the received explanation for the nature of the place that has been their neighbor across their entire community's memory, the large, empty, ruined settlement that sits at the edge of their daily landscape, close enough to see from the rooftops of ordinary houses and Willa mewing tells, far enough from ordinary living to have accumulated the particular quality that very old, very large, very empty places accumulate when enough time has passed. The story explains the silence. It explains the rooflessness. It explains why the temples stand while everything else has fallen. And it does this explaining in terms that feel proportionate to the scale of what needs explaining. Not a small story for a small event, but a story with a princess and a sorcerer and a curse and a whole town's worth of consequence. Scholars who study oral tradition as a cultural form have noted that the Bhangarh legend is an unusually effective example of what they call a flexible narrative template, a story structured so that its core can accommodate variation in its specifics without losing coherence. The emotional logic remains identical across all recorded versions. There is a violation of a sacred or social boundary. The violation produces a curse. The curse produces the abandonment. The abandonment produces the ruins. Each element follows from the one before it, with a consistency that makes the story feel satisfying, regardless of whether Singya or an unnamed ascetic is the central figure, regardless of whether the transgression is desire or ambition. The template holds, the details can shift. This structural durability is what the Bhangarh legend shares with other long-lived regional curse narratives across the Indian subcontinent. Stories attached to ruined forts, abandoned temples, dried riverbeds, places where something large once existed and no longer does. The question of what actually caused the thing to end is often unknowable with precision. The military campaigns, the political destabilizations, the famines, the slow withdrawal of resources and population that produce the gradual or sudden emptying of a place. These processes leave traces in the archaeological record, but not explanations that satisfy at the level of meaning. The legend provides what the archaeological record cannot. It assigns intention, names a transgressor, establishes a proportion between the fault and the consequence, and makes the ruin into a lesson rather than simply a remainder. None of this is to say that the legend is competing with the archaeological record or attempting to displace it. The two exist on different planes entirely. The scholars who have studied the historical abandonment of Bhangarh and the scholars who have studied the oral tradition attached to it are asking different questions of the same place. The archaeological and historical record asks what actually happened and in what sequence. The oral tradition asks what the happening meant and what it still means. Both questions are legitimate. Both bodies of inquiry have reached conclusions within their own terms. What neither has fully accounted for is the other, and the gap between them, the space between the documented campaign of Aurangzeb and the story of a maidservant carrying oil through a bazaar, is perhaps the most genuinely interesting feature of the Bhangarh case. The guides pointing out the boulder, the walls, the roofless dwellings, the intact temple columns, they are narrating a version of the story that has passed through many hands and many communities before arriving at them. The stone corridor they walk through daily has been the stage for the same narrative since well before anyone now living was born. And the story itself, with its shifting details and its stable structure, its two moral centers, and its one geographical endpoint, continues to move through the communities of the Alwar district in the way that durable stories move, not unchanged, because nothing alive is unchanged, but recognizable across the distance of all the generations that have held it. What is worth sitting with, finally, is not the question of whether the curse happened, or whether Singya was a real person, or whether the boulder moved. These are questions that sit outside the domain of what the tradition is offering. The tradition is offering something more specific, a centuries-old account of what it means to misuse power, whether that power is the power of tantric knowledge or the power of rank and wealth, and what happens to a place when the people entrusted with its care put their own wants above the boundaries placed on them. That this account has been told across different communities with different moral emphases, absorbing the concerns of each while maintaining the structure of all of them, is itself a kind of documentation, not of the events of 1620 or whenever the critical rupture is meant to have occurred, but of the ongoing moral life of the region that the fort once served and that the ruin now inhabits. A story that survives for 300 years is surviving for a reason. What the reason is, what need the story is meeting, what work it is doing for the communities that keep telling it, is perhaps not a question with a single answer, and perhaps not a question that needs one. The legend of Bhangarh continues to move through the Alwar district in its multiple forms, settling differently in different mouths, picking up new details here and shedding old ones there, finding its way into the narration of guides and the conversation of villagers and the documentation of researchers who write down what they hear. The fort sits at the edge of the Aravalli Hills, the bizarre corridor running north to south through the silence, the temples holding their roofs against a sky that does not ask why the dwellings beside them are open, the stone walls the same stone as the hills behind them, the story still moving, the way stories do, from voice to voice across the long, unhurried quiet of all the years. The signboard is yellow and black. It stands at the point where the footpath from the car park meets the first stone gateway of the fort, positioned so that a visitor encounters it before passing through any arch, before seeing any ruin, before the scale of the place becomes apparent. The text is printed in two languages, Hindi above, English below, and in the English version it reads, with the plain authority of a government directive, that entering the boundaries of Bhangarh Fort before sunrise or after sunset is strictly prohibited. It is a standard archaeological survey of India, notice in its format and in its tone. It looks in the photographs that journalists and visitors have reproduced thousands of times across print and digital media, like what it is, an official sign posted at the entrance to a protected heritage site, the kind of thing that appears at the gates of old monuments across India, worded to mark the boundary between permitted and unpermitted access. What makes it unusual is not the sign itself. What makes it unusual is the conversation it has generated, the decades of interpretation, the columns of print journalism, the television documentaries, the online debates, and the accumulated body of public attention that has gathered around a piece of yellow and black government signage at a medieval fort in the Alwar district of Rajasthan, until the sign itself became more widely discussed than the ruins it stands in front of. The authority behind the closure derives from legislation rather than local decision. The Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Sites and Remains Act, passed in 1958 and amended in 2010, grants the Archaeological Survey of India broad and clearly defined powers to regulate access to the more than 3,600 centrally protected monuments it manages across the country. Those powers include the ability to restrict or prohibit entry during specified hours for reasons of preservation, public order, or public safety, without requiring the nature of the specific concern to be spelled out in the signage itself. The Act is primarily a conservation instrument written to protect the physical fabric of India's documented heritage from damage, from vandalism, from unsupervised access after dark, from the kind of casual deterioration that accumulates when large numbers of people move through structurally compromised spaces without supervision. The nighttime closure at Bhangarh sits within this framework. It is, in legal terms, a heritage management decision taken under existing statutory authority by the body empowered to take it. ASI officials have been direct about the practical reasons for the restriction. In interviews with journalists from national and regional publications, interviews that have been sought repeatedly over the years as the site's reputation has grown, the stated reasoning has been consistent. The fort complex is large, spanning several kilometers of enclosed area, with ruined structures in varying states of deterioration. Stone walls that have stood for 3 centuries without maintenance carry risks that are not always immediately visible to a visitor moving through the space. Steps are uneven, floors are broken, and unpredictable underfoot. Arches and lintels that appear stable in daylight carry structural compromises that are not apparent without engineering assessment. After dark, with no artificial lighting anywhere within the fort's boundary walls, the risk of injury to an unsupervised visitor moving through the complex is not hypothetical. It is the kind of concrete, straightforward risk that heritage site managers account for at ruined monuments the world over. There is a second reason that officials have cited, one that carries its own particular weight, given the specific landscape the fort occupies. Bhangarh sits on the northern boundary of the Sariska Tiger Reserve, a nationally designated wildlife protection zone extending across more than 800 square kilometers of the Aravalli Range. The reserve's documented resident population includes leopards, jackals, several species of deer, and a range of smaller mammals whose activity patterns shift substantially between day and night. The boundary between the fort complex and the reserve is not a hard barrier. The natural landscape that surrounds the ruins transitions into protected forest without a clear dividing line in most directions, and animals from the reserve move through and around the fort walls as a matter of ordinary habitat use. After dark, when the human presence that keeps large predators at a cautious distance is removed, the risk profile of moving alone through the complex changes in ways that are entirely biological rather than supernatural. The ASI's stated concern about wildlife encounters is not speculative. It is grounded in what the surrounding landscape actually contains. The officials have gone further than simply explaining the safety rationale. Across multiple documented press statements and interviews spanning the period during which the site's paranormal reputation has grown most rapidly, the ASI has explicitly and repeatedly denied that the nighttime closure has any connection to supernatural or paranormal belief. The ghost-related interpretation of the signboard, officials have stated, is a product of public imagination and media amplification rather than any official governmental position on what occurs inside the fort after dark. The government of India does not, the stated position holds, manage its protected monuments on the basis of folklore. The sign means what it says. It is a safety restriction. The rest is not the ASI's position. The rest belongs to the public conversation that has grown up around the sign rather than to the institution that placed it there. That conversation, by any measure, has been considerable. The Bhangarh signboard has appeared in news reporting by outlets including the Times of India, Hindustan Times, India Today, BBC News, and a range of regional and international publications, almost all of which have framed the closure as at minimum suggestive of governmental acknowledgement of something beyond ordinary safety concerns. The framing varies. Some coverage is speculative, some is ironic, some presents the official explanation alongside the folkloric one as though they carry equal documentary weight, but the direction of travel is consistent. The sign, in popular media coverage, is treated as a piece of evidence in a larger argument about what Bhangarh is, rather than as an administrative notice at a deteriorating medieval ruin. The gap between the ASI's stated position and the public interpretation of that position is itself a documented phenomenon, one that has widened steadily as coverage of the site has accumulated. Across the more than 3,600 monuments the ASI manages, the majority are also closed to visitors after sunset. This is not unusual. Heritage sites across India, the stone mandapas and temple tanks of Hampi in Karnataka, the red sandstone gateways and mosque courts of Fatehpur Sikri in Uttar Pradesh, the granite ramparts and cisterns of Golconda Fort in Telangana, are secured at the end of the permitted visiting day, their gates closed, their premises cleared of visitors by closing time. These closures are enforced by the same legal framework that applies to Bhangarh. They carry comparable practical justifications: structural deterioration, limited supervision capacity after hours, the basic logic of protecting large unlit heritage spaces from unsupervised use after dark. None of these closures are accompanied by a posted textual prohibition At the gate, none of them has generated equivalent media attention. The gates at Hampi are sufficient to mark the boundary. No sign elaborates on the restriction. No language appears in two fonts and two languages to specify the hours of prohibition. The gates close. The monuments stand in the dark. The visiting day ends. At Bhangarh, the sign is there. It adds language to the closure that other comparable sites do not carry. Whether that additional language reflects a considered decision about visitor behavior at a site with a particularly active reputation for trespassing, or reflects some other institutional judgment, the ASI has not specified. What can be observed is the effect. The sign exists. It is photographed. It is reproduced. It is read by visitors who have already arrived at the fort, carrying a body of cultural information about what the site is supposed to be, and that body of information transforms the reading of the sign. The same text placed at the gate of any other ASI-managed monument would be read as what it is, a standard closing time notice. Placed here, at this gate, it becomes something that requires interpretation. The question of why the language at Bhangarh is explicit, where the language at Fate for Sikri is absent, has not been answered in the public record in any detail that settles the matter. The interpretive pattern that the sign has generated follows a recognizable logic. If a place has an existing reputation as a site of unusual experience, a piece of official policy that can be read as consistent with that reputation will tend to be absorbed into it, regardless of the stated official reasoning. The ASI's safety explanation does not circulate with the same velocity as the ghost story. This is not a feature specific to Bhangarh. It is simply how attention moves through existing cultural frameworks. The explanation that fits the story, already in circulation, travels more readily than the explanation that sits outside it. What makes Bhangarh a particularly clear example of this pattern is the scale of the discrepancy. The official position is documented, consistent, and specific in its reasoning. The popular interpretation is also documented, widely held, and specific in its claim. Both are real. They address the same sign. They reach different conclusions about it. The fort that the sign stands in front of is by daylight and during permitted hours an open and accessible heritage site. Visitors arrive from Alwar, from Jaipur, from Delhi, and further on weekdays and weekends throughout the year. Guides conduct tours through the bazaar corridor and up toward the palace. Families photograph the carved columns of the Gopinath temple. Children run along the stone paths between the roofless shop walls of the market. Archaeologists have worked within the complex. Conservationists have assessed the structural condition of the surviving walls. The ASI has conducted surveys. The site is not sealed. It is not mysterious in its access. During the hours the sign permits, it is what it appears to be, a large medieval ruin in the Aravalli Hills, open to anyone who makes the drive to reach it, standing in the sun, in the seasonal dust in a landscape of scrub forest and granite outcrops, doing nothing in particular that a medieval ruin does not ordinarily do. The hours the sign does not permit are different in the specific sense that no one with official authorization has documented what occurs within the walls after dark. This is not because the ASI suspects something occurs. It is because the complex is closed, as it is closed because roofless stone rooms and unlit paths and the open boundary of a wildlife reserve at night present a clearly articulable set of physical risks. What does occur within the fort walls after sunset is what occurs within the walls of any large medieval stone ruin in Rajasthan after sunset. The temperature drops, the wind moves through the broken archways and the roofless chambers. The nocturnal animals of the Sariska landscape move through the surrounding scrub, and the stone sits in the dark, as it has sat for 3 centuries, doing what stone does, which is nothing at a rate imperceptible to anything capable of observation. The specific texture of the after dark fort, described by the handful of people who have entered it without authorization and returned to describe the experience, is a separate category of documentation that sits alongside and distinct from the ASI's stated position. Those accounts exist. They appear in personal writing, in media reporting, and in the production material of the television programs that have used Bhangarh as a location. They are accounts of the fort at night, delivered by people who broke the posted rule to be there. Whatever they contain, sounds, silences, equipment readings, personal states, they are generated in specific conditions, extreme darkness, in a structurally deteriorating complex adjacent to a wildlife reserve, in the heightened psychological state that accompanies trespassing at a location already understood to be one of the most discussed haunted sites in India. These are conditions that produce their own particular quality of reported experience, which is not the same thing as saying the experiences are not genuine to those who had them. The sign marks the boundary, and the boundary has its own quality of invitation for certain kinds of visitors. The Owl's Eye has acknowledged this dynamic indirectly in the documented observation that Bhangarh's paranormal reputation is a significant driver of the tourism that brings visitors to the site. Tourism that is, in the permitted hours, entirely lawful and economically significant to the local area. The guides who walk visitors through the bazaar corridor and up toward the palace terrace earn their income from visitors who have come at least partly because of the story the sign has come to represent. The sign is, in this sense, doing more than one kind of work simultaneously. It marks a legal boundary. It also functions as a piece of the site's identity in the cultural conversation about what Bhangarh is, an identity that is not entirely separable from the visits and the income and the attention that the site receives. The ASI manages more than 3,600 monuments. This is the one where the sign became famous. The text of the sign does not use the word haunted. It does not mention ghosts, spirits, or the curse legend associated with the site. It does not make any claim about the nature of the after dark risk beyond the implied statement that entry is prohibited. In the Hindi version, the language carries the flat authority of a government directive. In the English version, the phrase strictly prohibited does the same work. It marks a rule, clearly, without elaboration. The official reading of the text is a safety notice. The popular reading of the text is something different, a governmental acknowledgement, however indirect, that the site is not ordinary. These two readings are not reconcilable. They do not resolve into each other. They coexist in the documentation of the site, each supported by the people who hold it, and the sign itself stands between them, unchanged. When the last permitted visitors leave the fort in the evening, a point that falls at different times across the year, as the sunset moves through the Rajasthani calendar, the gates are secured. The stone pathways that run from the northern entrance through the bazaar corridor and uphill toward the palace are empty. The carved columns of the Gopinath temple stand in the failing light. The roofless shop walls along the bazaar corridor hold the last warmth of the day in their stone before releasing it into the cooling air of the Aravalli evening. The ornamental archways of the palace at the southern end of the complex are visible from the lower levels of the fort as dark outlines against a sky that shifts from orange through deep blue and into the particular darkness of a rural Rajasthan night, which is darker than most city visitors expect because there is very little artificial light within several kilometers of the fort in most directions. A ranger or ASI official making a final sweep of the accessible areas of the complex, and the hour before closing moves through the same corridors and past the same structures that visitors have moved through all day. The task is ordinary heritage management work, checking that no visitor has been missed, that no one is still photographing in the upper palace area, that the complex is clear for the night. The long shadows of the Aravalli Hills reach across the lower sections of the fort from the western sky as the official passes through the bizarre corridor. The stone walls on either side still detailed enough in the low-angle light that the individual courses of masonry are visible, the textures of 3 centuries of weathering legible in the warmly lit surface. The fort is a place being checked, as monuments are checked at closing time, by a person whose job it is to check it. It is, at that moment, exactly what the ASI says it is: a protected heritage site being managed according to standard procedure. It is worth sitting with the sites that are not Bhangarh for a moment. The red sandstone gateways of Fatehpur Sikri rise at the edge of a ridge in Uttar Pradesh, the abandoned Mughal capital that Akbar constructed and then left, a story of desertion with its own unresolved explanations, its own contested reasons for why a city built at such cost was not occupied for more than a generation. The gates close at sunset. Visitors leave. No sign specifies the hours. The fort at Golconda, outside Hyderabad, its massive granite walls and cisterns, and the long stairways ascending through successive enclosures to the summit pavilions, closes when it closes. The stone landscape of Hampi, a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Karnataka, where a vast royal capital was sacked and abandoned in 1565, and has sat in varying states of ruin ever since, is also managed by the ASI and also cleared of visitors at the end of the permitted day. These are large, old, partially ruined places with their own histories of abandonment and their own folkloric contexts. They are closed at night. No posted textual restriction specifies the prohibition in 2 languages at the entrance gate. The difference, as far as the available documentation allows it to be characterized, is the pre-existing story. Bhangarh carries into every encounter with its administrative facts a body of cultural expectation that has accumulated across several centuries and been actively amplified by media coverage in the decades since television and digital distribution made regional legends nationally and internationally accessible. That expectation transforms the reading of administrative facts. A standard safety closure becomes, inside the interpretive frame the story provides, something that requires a deeper explanation. A sign that specifies prohibited hours in explicit language becomes, inside that frame, evidence that the specificity is necessary. The ASI's patient and consistent clarification that the prohibition is a safety measure does not empty the sign of the meaning the interpretive frame has loaded into it, because the interpretation is not responding to the ASI's stated position, it is responding to the story. And the story is older and more widely distributed than any press statement. This is not, to be clear, a claim that the interpretation is correct. It is an observation about how interpretive frameworks work, how an existing story shapes the reading of facts that arrive inside it, how a safety notice at one location can carry the weight of a different kind of message when the location has a particular kind of story attached to it, and how the gap between the official position and the public interpretation can widen across time as coverage accumulates, and each new article or documentary that treats the sign as suggestive adds another layer to the interpretive frame. The ASI's position is the ASI's position. The public interpretation is the public interpretation. Neither has displaced the other. They have been concurrent for long enough that the concurrence itself is a documented feature of how Bhangarh exists in the public record. The complex is fully dark by the time the last color leaves the sky above the Aravalli Hills. The fort's boundary walls, quarried from the same sandstone and granite that forms the hills they stand against, disappear into the surrounding darkness. The palace at the southern end of the complex, its ornamental archways and broken floors and roofless chambers, becomes shapes against a dark sky, legible to nothing, visible to nothing, holding the specific quality of silence that belongs to large stone structures after dark, in a landscape where human activity has stopped for the night. The seasonal water sources that flow down from the hills in the monsoon months and then recede, the hydraulic logic that allowed the founders to place a settlement of several thousand people in this particular valley, are quiet or dry, depending on the season. The Sariska tree line is not visible from within the fort walls after dark. It is simply there, beyond the boundary, part of the same continuous night that covers the ruins and the reserve, and the village of Gola Kabas, and the road to Alwar, and the whole landscape in every direction. The Azai sign is still there in the morning when the first visitors arrive. It has been there through the night, as it is there every night. The yellow and black notice in 2 languages marking the boundary between permitted and prohibited access, positioned at the point where the path from the car park meets the first gate of the fort. Visitors who arrive early photograph it before they photograph anything else. Some of them have driven through the night to arrive at the moment the gate opens, because the sign's reputation has made the act of arriving at the first permitted moment its own kind of event. The stone walls of the fort rise above the entrance in the early morning light, the Aravalli Hills behind them, the carved gateway ahead, the bazaar corridor, and the palace, and the temples, and the stepwells, all still there inside the walls, unchanged by the night, holding nothing that any documented investigation has confirmed or any official body has claimed. The sign says what it says. The fort is what it is. The question of whether these 2 things, the official document and the ancient place, require the same kind of attention or different kinds, is the question that visitors have been bringing to the gate for longer than the sign has been posted, arriving with the story already in place, reading the administrative text through the lens of something much older, carrying both back out with them when the visiting day ends and the gates close and the Aravalli Hills receive their long, unhurried shadow across the empty courtyards and the roofless bazaar and the silent palace at the top of the hill. That is the documented record at the gate of Bhangarh Fort. The ASI has stated its position clearly and on multiple occasions. The closure is a safety measure. The after-dark prohibition is a standard heritage management protocol. The ghost-related interpretations are not governmental policy. These are the official statements, and they are consistent, and they are grounded in the legal framework that governs the management of protected monuments across India, and they are available to anyone who reads the press releases or the interview transcripts or the statements made to the courts that have at various points heard arguments about access to the site. They are also, as a body of official communication, among the most widely reproduced statements made by the ASI about any single site in its care. Reproduced primarily because the site's reputation has made its administrative facts into a subject of public interest that other protected monuments' administrative facts are not. Of the more than 3,600 monuments the ASI manages, this is the one where the sign became the subject. Not the carved mandapa columns of Hampi, not the geometric courtyard of Fatehpur Sikri, not the ramparts of Golconda with their centuries of siege history and their own stories of loss and abandonment. This one, the yellow and black notice in 2 languages at the northern gate of a medieval Rajput fort in the Alwar district, sitting at the edge of a valley in the Aravalli range, posting a rule that the ASI has said is about safety, standing in front of ruins that have been standing for 3 centuries, in a landscape that continues on all sides without particular concern for what the sign means or does not mean or has come to represent in the long and still accumulating conversation that surrounds it. The sign stands there in the morning light when the gate opens. It stands there in the evening light when the gate closes. It was there last night. It will be there tomorrow. The stone behind it is the same stone it has always been. At the northern entrance to the bazaar corridor, the path levels briefly before beginning its long ascent south. Stone walls rise on both sides, not high enough to block the sky, but high enough that the corridor feels contained, directed, like a place that was built to move people in one particular direction. Looking south from this point, the 2 rows of roofless shop walls frame a perspective that runs uphill for several hundred meters and ends at the far edge of visibility at the dark horizontal line of the first palace gateway. The path is unpaved stone and compacted earth. The walls are sandstone and granite, the same red ochre and gray material that makes up the Aravalli Hills, visible above the roof lines on both sides. Standing here, in the middle of what was once a functioning market street, the scale of what Bhangarh actually was begins to arrive in the body rather than just the mind. The shop walls lining the bazaar corridor are not the romantic colonnades of a partially preserved ruin. They are plain and practical, small rectangular enclosures, the walls standing to varying heights, some barely knee-high, where the upper courses have collapsed into rubble, others chest-high or taller, where the original masonry has held. The spacing between individual structures is narrow in some places, wider in others, and the variation in the width and depth of each enclosure suggests different commercial functions. A small kiosk requiring very little floor area alongside a larger merchant space that would have needed room for goods to be stored and displayed. The stone at the base of the walls is heavier, more carefully fitted, the kind of work that was meant to last. Whatever sat above it, timber frames, fabric covers, additional courses of lighter stone, is gone, and the resulting open-roofed shells stretch south in 2 parallel lines, patient and legible, still organizing the space between them into something recognizable as a street. Walking south through the corridor, the grade rises gradually. The path underfoot is uneven in places where tree roots have pushed up between the paving stones, and frost cycles over 3 centuries have shifted the ground beneath. Vegetation grows in the joints of the walls on both sides, small-leafed plants, tufts of dry grass, occasionally a young tree that has found enough soil in the rubble to take hold. None of this is aggressive growth. The plant life at Bhangarh is the quiet, incremental kind, the kind that works its way into cracks over decades and centuries, rather than overwhelming a structure in a single season. The stone has been a stronger force than the vegetation for a long time, and the balance between them is visible in how the walls still define the street, while the plants simply occupy whatever space the walls have conceded. The light inside the corridor depends heavily on the time of day. In the hours after dawn, when the sun is still low in the east and the Aravalli Hills to the west have not yet begun to cast their long afternoon shadows, the corridor receives direct horizontal light that picks out the texture of the sandstone walls in close relief, every tool mark, every surface irregularity made visible by the low angle of illumination, By midday, the light is directly overhead, flattening everything, washing out the color of the stone, and making the corridor feel wider and more exposed than it does in the early hours. In the afternoon, the western hills begin to block the sun earlier than the open plain would, and the corridor moves into shadow section by section, from west to east. As the angle decreases, the sandstone cooling from warm ochre to a quieter grayer tone as the direct light withdraws. Midway along the bazaar, where the walls on the eastern side are still standing to something close to their original height, there is a section where the corridor narrows slightly, and the stone overhead on that eastern side catches the afternoon light at an angle that illuminates a band of carved decorative detail running along the top of the surviving course. It is modest decoration, a repeated geometric border rather than figurative carving, but its presence confirms that even the commercial structures of Bhangarh were built with some attention to appearance, that the people who used this market every day lived within a built environment that included, even in its practical spaces, a small amount of considered ornament. That detail, the carved border near the top of a shop wall in the middle of a ruined bazaar, is the kind of thing that takes a moment to register and then does not quite leave. The Gopinath temple stands just off the main corridor, positioned to be visible from the bazaar path without being directly on it, its placement suggesting a deliberate relationship between the commercial and the sacred within the fort's spatial logic. It is the most complete structure at Bhangarh by a considerable distance. The roof is intact. The carved stone columns of the outer mandapa, the pillared hall that serves as an entrance to the inner sanctum, are still standing at their full height, and the detail in the carving is legible even to an observer without technical training in medieval Rajasthani temple architecture. Figures, patterns, flora rendered in low relief along the column shafts, bracket capitals where the columns meet the horizontal members of the roof structure. The quality of the stonework here is noticeably finer than the bazaar walls. This was craftsmanship undertaken with a different level of care and resource, for a different and more permanent purpose. Standing in the mandapa of the Gopinath temple, looking from the shadowed interior toward the open sky ruins surrounding it, on all sides, the contrast between the two conditions, roofed and unroofed, preserved and open, is stark in a way that a plan drawing or a photograph does not fully capture. The temple occupies a small pocket of interior space within a much larger field of roofless shells, and from inside it, the surrounding structures appear as walls that once enclosed rooms and now enclose only sky. The columns of the mandapa are cool to the touch even in the afternoon heat. The stone floor inside the temple is worn smooth in the areas near the sanctum, worn by the movement of feet over a very long period, and that smoothness is a different kind of record than the inscriptions or the architectural plan. It is the accumulated physical evidence of a pattern of human behavior, of people moving in a particular direction, repeatedly over many years. The Gopinath temple is still used for worship. Occasional religious visitors come to make offerings at the sanctum, and the ritual activity at this specific temple means that it is maintained in a way that the surrounding ruins are not. The floor swept, the sanctum accessible, the physical space still functioning as it was designed to function, at least in its essential purpose. In this, the Gopinath temple is an exception within an exceptional complex, the one structure at Bhangarh that has remained continuously in its original relationship with the people who visit it. Its purpose, not just preserved in stone, but still operative. Everything else at the site is archaeological. The Gopinath temple is still, in a practical sense in use. Beyond the temple, continuing south and uphill, the bizarre corridor gives way to a broader open area where the density of structures decreases and the path widens, passing through a succession of gateways that mark the transition from the commercial and residential areas of the fort toward the palace complex at the summit. Each gateway is a substantial stone arch, some still largely intact, others reduced to the lower portions of their flanking walls, with the arch itself collapsed. They would have served as checkpoints in a living fort, spaces where the flow of people could be observed and controlled, and their positions along the ascending path create a rhythm of compression and release, a narrowing and widening of the experienced space as the walker moves south. The palace at the southern end of the complex occupies the highest point of the enclosed area, its back walls rising against the Aravali hillside, the rock of the hill and the masonry of the structure merging almost indistinguishably at some points along the upper perimeter. The outer walls of the palace are largely intact in terms of their vertical extent. They stand to something close to their original height along much of the perimeter, but the interior is thoroughly open. Roofs gone, floors broken by vegetation and root intrusion, and the slow settling of the ground beneath. Interior partition walls reduced in many places to low courses of stone that outline rooms without enclosing them. The spatial logic of the palace can still be read. The courtyards, the terraced levels rising toward the inner chambers, the elevated terrace at the highest point that would have offered an unobstructed view across the entire length of the fort and far out across the plains to the north. But the reading requires a kind of interpretive patience, a willingness to trace the original plan through the overlay of 3 centuries of decay. The ornamental archways within the palace interior are the most eloquent surviving evidence of what the complex once was. Several of these arches remain standing with their full profiles intact. The carved stone of their voussoirs still detailed enough that the original design intent is clear. These were entranceways to spaces of importance, their decorations signaling status, and craft in the visual language of Kachwaha Rajput court architecture. The arch forms are confident and proportioned, the carving at the keystone and along the intrados still readable even where surface weathering has softened the edges of the relief. Standing in the roofless chambers and looking through one of these arches at the hillside beyond, or at the open sky above the ruins on the other side, the arch frames the view in a way that feels compositionally precise, which may be coincidence, or may be a quality that attaches to any well-proportioned opening placed in any landscape over time. The floors of the palace courtyard areas are broken in most places, the original stone paving fractured and displaced by root growth and subsidence, sections of it missing entirely where stone has been removed or has simply fragmented. But in protected corners, sheltered from direct weather by surviving wall sections, longer stretches of the original floor surface have held, and these intact sections show the same careful stonework as the rest of the complex, cut and fitted with an attention to flatness and joint alignment that indicates skilled labor working to a specification. The vegetation that has pushed through the broken sections of the floor is dry and low-growing in most areas, the semi-arid Rajasthani climate limiting what can establish itself in the shallow soil that has accumulated over the stone. In a few places where a wall has collapsed and provided more accumulated debris, taller plants have taken hold, and their presence marks the locations of former structures as clearly as the surviving stone does. Moving through the palace on the way to the uppermost terrace, the visitor passes through several distinct spatial sequences: a gatehouse area, a forecourt, a more enclosed courtyard, and finally the approach to the elevated rear terrace, and the experience of this movement is one of the more interesting phenomenological features of the site, a quality that the plan of the complex does not predict. The spaces narrow and widen in deliberate alternation. Walls rise on both sides and then give way to an open sky court. A gateway compresses the path and then releases it into a broader area. The progression generates a sense of directed movement, even in a complex that has been substantially reduced from its original built volume, and the spatial logic survives, even where the built fabric that produced it is largely gone. The uppermost terrace of the palace looks north across the full length of the fort. From this position, on a clear afternoon, the view encompasses all of the main features of the complex below: the forecourts of the palace, the open area between the palace and the bazaar corridor itself, visible as a long, narrow slot between two rows of walls, the main gateway arches at the northern end, and beyond the boundary walls, the landscape of the Aravalli foothills opening into the scrub woodland, through which any approach to the fort from the plains below must pass. The distance from this point to the northernmost boundary wall is several hundred meters of gradually descending terraced ground, the whole of the enclosed area laid out below in a single uninterrupted view. The Sariska Tiger Reserve occupies the land immediately beyond the fort's southern and eastern boundaries, and the tree line of the reserve is visible from the palace terrace as a dense mass of vegetation that begins where the scrubby, semi-open landscape of the Aravalli foothills transitions to protected forest. The reserve designation has kept this adjacent land free of development, which means the view from the palace toward the south and east is of undisturbed forest, a deep green and gray-green canopy in the monsoon months, drier and more open-looking in the winter and summer seasons. The wildlife of the reserve uses the immediate vicinity of the fort as part of its range. Leopards have been photographically documented within the fort boundary. Sambar and chital deer move through the scrub between the outer walls and the tree line. Jackals are heard frequently in the hours around dawn and dusk. From the palace terrace in the late afternoon, the wildlife sounds from the Sariska direction shift perceptibly. The bird activity that characterizes the daytime, parakeets and bulbuls, and the occasional larger raptor, using the thermals above the Aravalli Ridge, begins to change register as the sun approaches the western hills. The day birds move into their roosting arrangements. The calls that replace them are different in character, lower, more intermittent, the sounds of animals transitioning from rest to activity as the light decreases. A jackal calling from somewhere in the scrub below the eastern boundary wall. The dry rattling sound of a large bird landing in one of the trees that has established itself within the fort's outer walls, in a courtyard where the roof has been gone long enough for the tree to grow to full height. The stepwells of the fort are not immediately visible from the main path through the complex. They occupy positions that would have made practical sense for a working settlement, positioned to serve the residential areas rather than the commercial corridor. Their locations determined by the hydraulic engineering of the original construction, which had to calculate where and at what depth the seasonal water table could be reached within the Aravalli terrain. The stepwell, or Bowery, as a form of water management infrastructure, is among the most technically demanding architectural achievements of the medieval Rajasthani tradition, a structure that requires accurate knowledge of subsurface water movement, careful management of the load-bearing forces on the descending masonry, and enough communal investment to justify the considerable labor of excavation. At Bhangarh, the surviving stepwells are dry or silted over. The seasonal water table that they were designed to reach has likely shifted over 3 centuries of landscape change, and in any case, the maintenance that would have kept the wells clear has not been performed for the same length of time. The stairs descend into a narrowing space, the stone steps still largely intact along the upper courses where they have been sheltered from direct weather by the walls on either side, the lower courses increasingly obscured by accumulated silt and the roots of plants that have found a purchase in the damp, shadowed environment toward the bottom. The stone of the well walls has a different quality to the touch than the stones of the structures above, more dense, more tightly fitted, the joints between courses finer, because the construction below the waterline had to resist hydrostatic pressure in a way that above-ground masonry did not. Standing at the top of a Bhangarh stepwell and looking down into the descending interior, the space has a particular quality of depth that is different from the depth of a standing wall or a ruined room. The stairs lead into a space that was once inhabited by water, that was designed around the behavior of water and the needs of people who depended on it, and that is now dry, still, and shadowed. The lowest visible steps are in partial darkness, even in the middle of the day, because the well walls rise on all sides, and the sun reaches the bottom only during certain hours and seasons. The masonry at the visible lower levels is intact. The original engineering has held, and this particular combination of depth, shadow, and surviving structural quality gives the stepwell a quality of preserved purposefulness that other ruined structures at the site do not quite have in the same way. The Bowery as a form reflects a specific relationship between a settlement and its landscape, the acknowledgement that water does not exist on the surface in sufficient quantity and that reaching it requires coordinated effort sustained over a long period. The Bhangarh stepwells are evidence of that relationship, of a community organized enough and invested enough in its own continuation to undertake the excavation, construction, and maintenance of hydraulic infrastructure on this scale. They are also evidence of planning. The founders and builders of Bhangarh did not simply occupy a position with natural water access. They engineered access to water at a site where the surface hydrology was insufficient for the population they intended to house, which indicates a level of commitment to the site's development that goes beyond opportunistic fortification. The fort's water management infrastructure in its entirety, the stepwells, the channels that would have directed monsoon runoff into cisterns, the drainage arrangements within the courtyard areas of the palace, represents a significant portion of the total construction investment at Bhangarh, much of it invisible because it was underground or has been filled in and built over. The surviving stepwells are the most accessible evidence of this infrastructure, but they should be understood as the surface manifestation of a more extensive engineering system that supported several thousand residents in a region of limited and irregular surface water for the better part of a century and a half. The afternoon light on the Aravalli stone has a particular quality in the hour before the sun reaches the western ridge. The sandstone, which appears relatively uniform in color at midday, differentiates into a range of ochre and rose and warm gray as the light angle decreases and the shadows in the surface texture deepen. The carved surfaces of the surviving temple columns and palace archways absorb this light differently than the uncarved wall surfaces. The relief carving catches and holds color in its recesses, while the convex surfaces bleach slightly in the direct illumination, creating a visual vibration across the carved area that makes the detail more readable at this hour than at any other time of day. Stone that looked static and monochrome at noon becomes warm and three-dimensional at 4 in the afternoon. The palace's ornamental archways in this light are worth particular attention. The carved stone around the arch introdos receives light at an angle that emphasizes its depth and irregularity, the deliberate marks of the carver's tools visible as a pattern of directional planes across the surface. The voussoirs of the arch itself, the wedge-shaped stones that distribute the load of the arch into the flanking columns, are visible at their joints, the fine lines between courses tracing the structural logic of the arch form in a way that makes the engineering as readable as the ornament. A well-preserved masonry arch carries its structural argument in its geometry, and the surviving palace arches at Bhangarh make that argument clearly, 3 centuries after the builders who set them in place moved on or died. Beyond the southern wall of the palace, the land falls sharply toward the Sariska tree line. The terrain in this direction is rocky and steep. The Aravalli hillside, covered with low vegetation between the outcrops of the same granite and quartzite that makes up the geological substrate of the whole range. The palace walls at their southern end use the natural rock face as a foundation in several places. The masonry keyed into the rock in a way that means the transition between natural stone and worked stone is not always clearly visible at the base of the wall. The builders here were not working against the landscape, but with it, the natural defensive advantage of the elevated position and the rocky southern approach was incorporated into the design rather than modified to accommodate a standard plan. That relationship between the construction and the underlying geology is one of the most consistent qualities of the fort as a whole. The boundary walls follow the natural contour lines of the Aravalli foothills, rather than imposing a geometric plan on terrain that does not naturally accommodate one. The terracing of the interior descends in steps that reflect the natural gradient of the hillside. The stepwells are positioned where the hydrology of the terrain placed the accessible water table. A Bhangarh was built into its landscape rather than onto it, and this integration means that after 3 centuries of abandonment, the ruins and the terrain have continued to settle back into each other, the stone returning, slowly and incrementally, to the hillside from which it was quarried. From the palace terrace, looking north in the late afternoon, the whole of the enclosed settlement is visible below, and the view makes the scale of the original construction genuinely legible in a way that walking through individual sections does not. The terraced levels of the ruined town descend from this point to the plain in a series of horizontal bands, each one lower and toward the north, slightly wider than the one above it. The overall form of the enclosed area, tracing the shape of the valley between the Aravalli spurs on either side. The bizarre corridor is visible as a long slot oriented north-south down the center of the middle terrace, the 2 rows of walls catching the angled afternoon light on their western faces and sitting in shadow on their eastern sides. The dimensional difference between the 2 conditions making the street plan readable from this distance. The boundary walls at the northern end of the complex, where the fort meets the open plain, are lower than the walls at the southern end. The defensive emphasis was always on the northern approach, the direction from which any threat from the plains would have arrived. The Sariska forest beyond the southern and eastern walls is already in shadow at this hour, the tree canopy dense enough that the afternoon light does not reach the ground beneath it at this angle. The tree line marks the boundary between the managed archaeological zone and the protected wildlife reserve as clearly as any signpost, and standing on the palace terrace and looking toward it, the relationship between the 2 different categories of protected land, one preserved for its human history, one preserved for its non-human inhabitants, is spatially immediate in a way that maps and administrative descriptions do not convey. The leopards that move through the Sariska forest and occasionally cross into the fort perimeter are not interested in the distinction. The stone of the palace terrace underfoot is the same material is the stone of the Aravalli Hills, rising above and behind the southern wall, quartzite and sandstone, and occasional outcrops of the harder granite that underlies much of the range. The quarried stone of the fort's construction came in the main from the same hills within which the fort sits, which means that the walls are, in a straightforward geological sense, still part of the hillside they were removed from. The cutting and dressing of the stone for construction did not change its mineral composition or its fundamental geological character. The passage of 3 centuries of weathering, the monsoon rains, the summer heat, the winter cold, the slow chemical action of the atmosphere on exposed stone, has been returning the surface of the worked stone towards something that more closely resembles the surface of the natural outcrops on the hillside above. In the late afternoon, standing on the terrace and looking out over the length of the fort toward the plain beyond, the stone of the walls and the stone of the hills and the stone underfoot are all catching the same light, and the ochre and rose and warm gray tones that differentiate them at noon have largely converged as the sun drops toward the western ridge. The terraced town below sits in its valley. The boundary walls run north and south, and around the perimeter in long horizontal courses of the same material as the ridge above. The forest to the south and east is a different texture and a different color entirely. The living green and gray-green of the reserve against the mineral ochre of the Aravalli stone, and this contrast is the sharpest visual fact of the view from the terrace at this hour. The fort is made of the hill it stands on, and the hill is surrounded by trees, and the trees are full of the sounds of animals beginning to move as the light goes. The carved detail on the surviving archways of the palace, seen in this late light from a few meters distance, has a quality of patient attention about it. Someone worked this stone carefully. Someone knew what the finished surface should look like and had the skill and time to produce it. The marks of the tools that produce the carving are still visible in the recesses, the regular parallel cuts of a chisel moving along a line, the rougher surface in areas where a punch was used to establish the depth of a relief field, the smoother surface where a finishing tool was drawn across the convex parts of the design. Stone carving of this kind is slow, cumulative work, and the volume of carved stone at Bhangarh, at the temple, at the palace gateways, in the decorative details of the residential structures that once lined the main corridor, represents a very large number of hours of precisely directed human labor. All of it is now sitting in a valley between 2 Aravalli spurs, open to the sky, occupied by birds and jackals, and the occasional leopard, visited by people who drive in from Alwar and Jaipur, and further away, who walk up through the bazaar and photograph the temple columns and try to read the geography of the palace from the surviving walls. The labor that built this place has been here for several centuries, embedded in the stone, and will remain here in the stone for a long time after the questions that bring people to the site have either been answered or quietly forgotten. Cold, the Aravalli hills that supplied the material for the walls are still supplying the same material in the same colors to the same light. The ridge above the southern wall, the same geological formation as the dressed stone of the terrace below it. The quarried and the unquarried still the same substance, sitting together under the same sky, in the same long afternoon quiet that descends on this part of the range every day as the sun moves toward the western horizon and the Sariska tree line holds its dark, patient line against the last of the light. The village of Gola Kabas sits close enough to the Bhangarh boundary walls that on still evenings the stones are visible above the roofline. The people who live there have always lived there, or near enough always, that the distance between living memory and inherited knowledge has grown thin. Journalists and documentary researchers who have made the journey out to Gola Kabas and sat with the older residents have consistently reported the same quality in the accounts they were given, not performance, not the polished delivery of a story told for effect, but something quieter than that. An elderly resident describing the sounds that come from within the fort walls after dark will use roughly the same tone as one describing the seasonal behavior of the monsoon or the soil condition in a particular field. The sounds are simply there. They have always been there. They are a feature of living where these people live, the way a river is a feature, or a particular wind off the Aravalli Hills. What the villagers have described, across multiple generations of accounts collected by journalists and researchers, is auditory. Faint music is how some have put it. Music that resembles the sound of classical Rajasthani court instruments, something stringed, something percussive, something that arrives at the edge of hearing and then is gone when attention moves toward it. The sound of movement, some have said, without a visible source, footsteps, or the suggestion of footsteps, or something that the ear reads as footsteps and the eye cannot confirm. These accounts have been in circulation long enough that they predate the era of paranormal television, long enough that they cannot reasonably be attributed to cultural feedback from media coverage. The fort is 300 years empty. The village has been next to it for all of that time. The sounds in the account of those who live there are not new. There is something worth attending to in that matter-of-fact register. The accounts that tend to attract the most attention are the theatrical ones. The visitor who fled the palace terrace, the investigation crew whose instruments behaved strangely. But the Gola Kabas accounts carry their own kind of weight, precisely because they are not theatrical. The person speaking is not trying to frighten anyone. They are describing the permanent auditory landscape of a place they have always known. The fort makes sounds after dark. This is simply what the fort does. Acoustic researchers and architectural historians have noted that a large enclosed, partially ruined stone complex of the kind that Bhangarh represents will produce sounds under the right atmospheric conditions that have entirely conventional origins. Stone contracts as temperature drops after sunset, wind moving through open chambers, through archways and corridors, and roofless rooms produces tonal effects that depend on the geometry of the openings, effects that can resemble music under certain conditions, that can change character as the wind changes, that can appear and disappear in ways that feel discontinuous and therefore unaccountable. A large ruin is, in acoustic terms, an instrument that has been left out in the weather for centuries and has developed its own unpredictable register. The sounds the villagers describe are genuinely there. What is producing them is a question that nobody has formally investigated, with the kind of rigor that would produce a conclusive answer. The Sariska Tiger Reserve begins at the fort's southern boundary. Leopards have been documented within the reserve. Jackals move through the scrubland at night. The nocturnal soundscape of the Aravalli foothills at the edge of a wildlife protection zone is not a simple or a silent one, and it shifts in character between dusk and deep night in ways that a human ear, particularly one primed by prior knowledge of the location, will interpret differently than it might if the same sounds were heard in a different place. This is not a dismissal, it is simply what the landscape contains. The question of which sounds belong to which source, in a place that contains this many sources, has not been settled by anyone who has studied it carefully. Within the fort complex itself, several categories of reported experience have accumulated across the years of visitor accounts. The most consistent of these consistent enough to constitute a documented pattern, concerns the palace ruins at the highest point of the fort. Accounts describing a sudden and unaccountable onset of disorientation, anxiety, or an urgency to leave the area have been placed at this specific location by enough independent visitors, recorded in enough separate formats, including travel forums, personal blogs, and media interviews, that the repetition itself is a data point worth holding. The accounts vary in their specifics. Some describe a sense of being watched. Some describe a drop in temperature that the surrounding heat does not explain. Some describe a simple and overwhelming desire to be somewhere else, without a story attached to it, without a cause the visitor could identify. The roofless chambers of the palace have particular spatial qualities that architectural researchers have noted as relevant here. Stone enclosures open to the sky create unusual acoustic conditions. Sounds from outside enter easily, but the stone walls reflect and complicate them, and the absence of the absorptive surfaces that a roofed room would provide means that the sonic environment inside a roofless chamber is strange in ways that are difficult to consciously identify. The disorientation may have a partial origin there. The heat in Rajasthan during the summer months is a documented physiological factor. The palace terrace, elevated and shadeless, exposed to direct sun across the hours of peak temperature, is a location where heat-related symptoms including lightheadedness, anxiety, and an urgency to find shade present as entirely conventional responses to physical conditions. These explanations are on record. They account for some of what visitors report. Whether they account for all of it is less clear. The photographs are their own category. Amateur and semi-professional photographers have been bringing cameras to Bhangarh for decades, and the archive of images that has accumulated is extensive. Within that archive, a subset of images has circulated widely across social media and paranormal discussion forums. Images containing orbs of light, blurred shapes in archways, elongated motion streaks, forms in the shadows of the bizarre corridor that their photographers have described as figures. Skeptical analysis of the most widely shared examples has consistently produced conventional explanations. Orbs in the dusty, dry environment of a Rajasthan ruin in direct sunlight are a well-documented lens artifact. Particles of dust or sand caught in the field of the flash or in the bright ambient light, photographically rendered as glowing circles that the human pattern recognition system reads as intentional shapes. Long exposure photography in low light produces motion blur from any moving element in the frame, including the photographer's own hands. Social media image compression at reduced resolution introduces artifacts that can resemble shapes, particularly in areas of shadow where the compression algorithm simplifies gradient information. These analyses are available. They have been applied to specific images by specific analysts in documented exchanges. The question of whether they account for every image in the archive is genuinely open because the archive is large and not every image has been formally analyzed. The pattern that runs through this category of account, the image that seemed to show something, submitted to scrutiny, explained or partially explained, replaced by another image from another visit that is subjected to the same cycle, is itself worth noting. The production of anomalous images at Bhangarh is continuous. The cycle does not close. Local guides who work the Bhangarh complex as their livelihood have contributed their own category of account to the accumulated record. Electronic devices behaving unexpectedly, cameras losing power rapidly, mobile phones dropping signal, batteries draining in a way that visitors have described as unusual. These reports come through the guides with some regularity, particularly in relation to specific areas of the fort near the palace complex and the Mangla Devi temple. The guides themselves, in documented conversations with journalists and researchers, note the relevant context without being prompted. Bangor's reputation as a haunted site is the reason visitors come in the numbers they do. The guide's employment, the entire local economy of tourism that has grown around the fort, depends on that reputation remaining live. This does not mean the reports are fabricated. It is simply a piece of context that a careful reader of the accounts will include alongside the account itself. Battery drainage and electronic devices can have multiple conventional sources, including temperature, cold, and heat. Both affect lithium battery performance in ways that users frequently misread as device malfunction. Signal loss in a location within the Aravalli Hills, where the topography creates natural radio shadows, is a straightforward consequence of geography. These explanations exist, whether they account for every reported instance or whether some residue of unexplained behavior remains after those explanations are applied, is a question the record does not definitively resolve. The television investigations represent a different layer of the archive entirely. Indian television networks have produced paranormal investigation programs featuring Bhangarh with enough regularity that the fort has become a recurring set, a location whose visual and atmospheric qualities translate well to the format and whose reputation provides a pre-existing narrative that a production team can enter rather than having to build from nothing. The equipment deployed in these productions includes electromagnetic field detectors, infrared thermometers, and in some cases audio recording apparatus. The footage produced in these settings has generated its own secondary archive of discussed anomalies, EMF spikes, temperature readings, sounds recorded and played back for audiences as evidence of something present. What researchers and journalists studying the intersection of media and paranormal culture have documented around Bhangarh is a feedback loop with identifiable mechanics. The fort's folkloric reputation generates visitor interest. Visitor interest generates accounts. Accounts generate media coverage. Media coverage, particularly the television investigation format, produces imagery and audio that circulates further. Wider circulation generates more visitors, more accounts, more media interest. The fort has become, as measured by the consistency and volume of cultural output it generates, the most discussed allegedly haunted location in India by a considerable margin. That status is now self-sustaining in a way that makes it genuinely difficult to separate what the place produces from what the attention brought to it has added. This is not a reason to dismiss the accounts. The villagers of Gola Kabaz were describing sounds coming from the fort before any television crew arrived. The pattern of reported unease at the palace terrace appears across accounts with no evident connection to one another, written in different formats at different times. The question of what the media feedback loop has amplified versus what it has invented is not a simple one, and a careful treatment of the record does not collapse those two things into each other. What the EMF readings from the television investigations have not been formally analyzed is also worth noting. The EMF detectors used in paranormal television productions are consumer-grade instruments designed for electrical safety inspections, sensitive to the ordinary electromagnetic fields produced by power lines, appliances, and other infrastructure. A ruined fort without electricity, without infrastructure, in a region of Rajasthan with limited urban development nearby, should produce very low baseline EMF readings in the absence of the production equipment itself. Whether the documented spikes represent something outside the range of what the surrounding environment would produce, or whether they represent the equipment's own field or the presence of the production crew's electronics, is a question that none of the television productions have formally addressed. There are accounts that do not fit cleanly into the categories above. A researcher collecting oral history in the Alwar district in the early 2000s recorded an account from a middle-aged man who had worked as a laborer at the fort during a period of restoration work. He described, without elaboration and without any claim to a paranormal explanation, a recurring experience of arriving at work to find that certain materials left inside the complex overnight had been moved, not damaged, not stolen, moved to different positions within the same area. He attributed this, in his own telling, to jackals. It is worth noting that he offered that explanation himself, that he was not asked to choose between a paranormal and a conventional account. He had already decided. The question was simply where the jackals were during the hours they moved things. The women who sell marigold garlands and coconuts at the entrance to the Gopinath temple, the one structure within the Bhangarh walls that retains its roof and remains an active site of worship, have their own relationship to the fort's reputation, one that does not map neatly onto the tourist-facing paranormal narrative. For them, the temple is not a haunted place, but a sacred one. The distinction matters. The Gopinath temple has been maintained as a functioning site of Hindu worship through the fort's centuries of abandonment, attended to by priests and communities for whom the place's spiritual significance has nothing to do with the ghost tourism economy that has grown up around the outer ruins. The offerings left at the temple, the prayers conducted there, the garlands placed on the columns, these are evidence of a relationship with the site that runs on a different register than any of the categories of account discussed above. The coexistence of those registers within the same enclosure is one of the more genuinely interesting things about Bhangarh as a place. An active temple within a designated haunted ruin, priests conducting worship in the same complex where television crews deploy EMF detectors, elderly villagers describing sounds in the same matter-of-fact voice they use for weather, while a few kilometers away, in the nearest city, tour operators package overnight ghost hunts. The fort holds all of these simultaneously. It does not choose between them. It simply continues to be there, inside its walls, on its hillside, as it has been for a little over 4 centuries. The ASI sign at the entrance, bilingual, yellow and black, prohibiting entry before sunrise and after sunset, has been photographed so many times that it has its own substantial image, archived separate from any photograph taken inside the complex. It appears in travel blogs from every year since the proliferation of personal digital photography. It appears in paranormal documentary footage. It appears in academic papers on the sociology of haunted tourist sites, and in journalism pieces ranging from respectful to satirical. The sign is, at this point, as much a cultural artifact as the ruins behind it, an object that has accumulated meaning through the attention paid to it, meaning that its authors almost certainly did not intend, and that it cannot itself verify or deny. The ASI has maintained its position through every cycle of media attention the fort has generated. The closure is structural. The closure is for public safety. The closure is consistent with the way other protected monuments are managed at night. No official body within the Indian government has acknowledged a supernatural explanation for the restriction, and the ASI has explicitly denied one in documented statements on multiple occasions. These statements exist in the record alongside everything else in the record. They do not cancel the reports. The reports do not cancel them. The two bodies of material sit alongside each other in the archive of things that have been officially said and officially documented about Bhangarh, and the space between them is not a gap that further statements have been able to close. One pattern that researchers studying visitor accounts have noted is the specificity of location within the reports of unease. The anxiety, the disorientation, the sudden compulsion to leave, these are placed with disproportionate consistency at the palace and at the transition zones between the bazaar section and the palace approach. They are placed less consistently and less prominently in the bazaar itself or in the lower sections of the fort near the entrance. This locational clustering within the reports is a feature of the archive that nobody has fully explained. It could reflect the elevated and shadeless nature of the palace terrace, producing more consistent heat-related effects. It could reflect the greater spatial complexity of the palace ruins compared to the simpler bazaar corridor, making disorientation more likely there. It could reflect the way the story is attached to the fort, prime visitors to expect something at the palace, given that the palace is narratively the destination of the legend, the place the princess was returning to, the highest and most enclosed point, the deepest interior of the site. What the clustering means is genuinely unclear. That it is there in the reports is simply what the reports show. The night photographs taken by those who have entered the complex after the permitted hours, accounts that exist in the record as a documented category of trespass, not as a practice the channel endorses or romanticizes, consistently describe the interior of the fort in the dark as an experience of particular acoustic intensity. Sound carries differently after the day visitors have gone. The jackals and the birds of the Sariska Edge make themselves heard in the absence of human noise. The stone of the walls, releasing the day's accumulated heat, produces its own sounds. People who have been inside after dark and written about it describe with some consistency the feeling of being in a place that was not waiting for them, that continued its own processes, regardless of their presence. The cooling stone, the animal calls, the wind through the archways, the sense of a complex that had been very full a very long time ago and was still, in some way that they found difficult to describe precisely, in the process of being that full place, even in its absence. This quality of description, the fort as a place still in motion, still inhabited by its own history, in some manner that does not resolve into a ghost story, but does not resolve into simple emptiness either, appears across enough independent accounts that it constitutes its own category. Not the theatrical reports of seeing something, not the instrument readings or the photographic anomalies, something quieter than those, and perhaps more durable, the quality of presence that a place that held thousands of people for a century and a half retains in its stone after 3 centuries of standing empty, that manifests not as apparition, but as atmosphere, as the specific gravity of a place that has been deeply inhabited and has not been inhabited since, and that carries in the arrangement of its walls and the quality of its silence something of what it used to hold. Whether that is a paranormal phenomenon or a psychological one, whether it resides in the stone or in the mind that reads the stone, is a question the record does not answer. Researchers who have studied the phenomenology of sacred and historically significant ruins have noted that humans reliably report a heightened sense of presence at locations that have been sites of concentrated human activity, regardless of the specific nature of that activity, and regardless of whether the location carries any folkloric narrative. The cathedral and the battlefield and the empty royal court all produce versions of this effect. Bhangarh, with its particular combination of historical depth, folkloric richness, and physical preservation at a specific midpoint between ruin and legibility, may simply be a very potent version of a widely reported phenomenon. That explanation is available. It accounts for much of what visitors describe. The residue that it does not account for, if any such residue exists, is something the available methodology has not yet measured. The fort persists. This is the simpler and more observable fact beneath everything else that has been said about it. The sandstone walls quarried from the Aravalli hillside still stand in their long horizontal lines across the slope. The bizarre corridor is still there, roofless and open, its shop walls standing to varying heights on either side. The Gopinath temple still receives its worshippers and its marigold offerings. The stepwells are still descending toward the dry water table below, their masonry intact, their stairs still counting the same graduated levels they counted when the water table was close enough to reach. The Sariska forest is still dark beyond the boundary walls to the south, and the animals that live in it continue to move through the scrubland at the fort's edge after dark, unaware of the debate that the place has generated. 300 years of accumulating accounts, the stories the Alwar district has always told, the guide's practice summary in the bazaar, the television crew in the corridor, the photograph on a travel blog, the elderly resident describing music coming from the empty walls, sit in the record alongside 300 years of stone and silence. None of it has produced a final answer. None of it has closed the case in either direction. The fort neither confirms the stories told about it nor refutes them. It simply stands on its hillside at the edge of the Aravalli Hills, holding whatever it holds in the particular way that very old stone holds things, densely, quietly, without comment. The ASI sign at the entrance will still be there in the morning. The carved columns of the Gopinath temple will catch the first light as they have caught it for 400 years. The bazaar corridor will be empty in the early hours before the gates open, the 2 rows of roofless stone walls holding the pre-dawn dark between them, the long perspective running uphill from the entrance toward the palace gates, still and unattended. A handful of visitors will already be on the road from Jaipur, headlights moving through the Aravalli foothills in the dark before sunrise, arriving at the gate in time for the first permitted entry. Some of them curious about the history, some of them hoping for something the history cannot confirm and the sign cannot deny. The fort will be there when they arrive. The hills around it will be the same material as the walls. The temple will be receiving the morning in the way it has received every morning since the priests maintained their presence through the centuries of abandonment. The bazaar will be quiet. The palace will be standing at the top of the hill with its roofless chambers and its ornamental archways, and the same chambers where so many accounts have placed so many moments of unexplained feeling, the same archways that have framed so many photographs carrying anomalies that analysis has partially explained and not entirely explained. The accounts will continue to accumulate. Each new visiting season brings its own file of observations, its own subset of images, its own reports delivered in their own registers, some theatrical, some matter of fact, some submitted to analysis, some simply added to the growing pile. The pile has been growing for as long as people have been paying the kind of attention to Bhangarh that generates written records, and it shows no sign of closing. What the accumulated record most clearly demonstrates is not that the fort is haunted, and not that it is not.